Hello and welcome to this third video in the module The Historical Development of Education. Today we're going to be looking at the development, or you might say the expansion, of higher education. In order to do that we need to understand where higher education as we know it today comes from, the recent developments over about the last 30 or 40 years which have been quite substantial in this area. Then we'll move on to the current position as things are today, and then we'll spend some time looking into the future and trying to make some predictions perhaps of the path of development and the options where higher education might go in the future. In order to understand higher education we have to see where it comes from. The first university was in Bologna, Italy, and the first UK institutions were Oxford and Cambridge in the latter Middle Ages in the 12th and 13th centuries. Those institutions remained essentially unchanged until the Renaissance period. The Renaissance period dates from the 1700s onwards, and there are clear links with the thinking of the Renaissance period with the Politics of Change module, where we're covering thinkers such as Hobbes and Locke, who are considered to be Renaissance thinkers. It's called the Renaissance because it was a return to beliefs about the world, thinking patterns, the way of structuring arguments based on the Greek tradition. People such as Plato and Aristotle. You have methods of Socratic reasoning, Socratic questioning based on the teachings of Socrates, ancient Greek, and also his pupil Aristotle, and Aristotelian thinking. Essentially, those who studied within the universities up until the middle of last century or so will have been exposed to classical literature and thought patterns, how to structure arguments according to logic, how to reason rationally, and also knowledge of philosophy and its inquisitorial methods. Predominantly, those that attended university were males from the elite classes in society. He advocates the value of a classical education. We can see here, for example, that a Oxbridge, i.e. Oxford or Cambridge classics degree was considered the cream of all qualifications, a gold standard for young people planning a career in the professions, civil service or even government. And hence you will often hear some commentators speaking about classics and the understanding of Greek literature and thinking as setting a gold standard. And you might be surprised to learn that university education as we know it today is and does have lots of classical educational threads running through it. For example, how you structure essays is based on the Renaissance classical period of logical argument and syllogistic reasoning. Our old friend here verses that on the one hand we can see higher education as intending to set standards of what is valid knowledge against current policy developments to increase participation, i.e. more numbers and more diverse people attending university, but also the types of courses studied are studied in a more flexible way. And these might be seen as in juxtaposition with higher education be seen as an elite education and accorded some form of standards, i.e. the traditional Greek standard. Okay, the first piece of policy that we're going to look at is the 1963 Robbins report. Throughout our report we have assumed it as an axiom that courses in higher education should be available to all who are qualified by ability and attainment to pursue them and who wish to do so. So we can see that one of the intentions of the Robbins report was to increase participation within university. From a take-up rate of 8%, so less than 1 in 10 people attending university in 1963, to increase to an aspirational target of 17%, almost 1 in 5, so double the amount by 1980. That process is often referred to as university expansion and sometimes known as massification. And we can think of expansion along the ways of this metaphor of a child blowing up a balloon. The opposite of expansion is contraction, of course, and we might see that as the balloon going down. The Robbins report advocated increased participation and increased flexibility, and two examples of how two programs that were brought into practice to achieve that was the Open University. Here we can see the Open University site, which you're free to browse at your leisure, and also the building of polytechnic higher education. With regard to the Open University, its more flexible methods enabled women, for example, to enter into higher education for the first time. Women were able to fit their studies around their current working lives or childcare commitments. And recently David Cameron has commended the Open University for its innovative approach. Polytechnics, on the other hand, were based on a series of reports at the time that Britain was lagging behind its competitors in its industrial and technical expertise, and we'll explore what those reports were and the implications in a later lecture. Consequently, there were about over 30 polytechnics built during the 60s and following period, intended to raise the status of vocational/technical qualifications. And clearly people who weren't suited to the traditional academic, and by that I mean heavily influenced by the classics education, could obtain places and succeed in the polytechnic education system. The polytechnics were brought to an end by the Further and Higher Education Act of 1992, and if you're so inclined you can read the legislation online on that link. The 35 existing polytechnics became universities. An example of that might be Leeds Polytechnic became Leeds Met, and also it created the Funding Council of HEFCE and Further Education Funding Council. I've missed the E off the end of HEFCE, so sorry about that. You can click on the HEFCE site here to see HEFCE's aims at widening participation within higher education. The following piece of policy that we're going to look at is the 1997 Deering Report into Higher Education and the Learning Society. It was hailed as the most comprehensive review of HE since the Robbins Report of the 60s, and concluded that the historic boundaries between academic and vocational learning were breaking down. Now this is debatable, but this is what the report concluded. There was increased partnership between higher education and industry and public service, and that means links between higher education institutions and employers, so that degrees would seem to have some sort of practical value in the marketplace. It also brought in this measure, this highly contestable measure, that higher education should no longer be free, but students should pay up to 25% of the cost of tuition. What's the position in 2010? Well, fees have been clearly climbing for students. Students' numbers have been increasing coming into university, and also the amount that they pay has been increasing. Please forgive me, there's an error there that I've missed the E off the end of HEFCE, in that it is the Higher Education Funding Council for England. As you can see, the correct version is there, and you can look on the HEFCE site and see their aims about increasing or widening participation or uptake in higher education. At the moment, HEFCE fund 130 higher education institutions, and Leeds Trinity is one of those, including 88 universities to the tune of £7.4 billion. As cuts are intended, it is envisaged that that number will be reduced. There are 2 million students registered on HE courses in England, and we can see that by far the greatest number of courses, the greatest popularity, is undergraduate full-time courses, followed by undergraduate part-time courses, and the other slices of the pie there indicate the postgrad courses being taught. A tiny proportion, more than 3/4, are undergraduate. University funding also comes from student fees, investments that the universities have, and employer contributions to research and course funding. Employer contributions clearly strengthen the links between business and what business expects or requires students to learn on their BA programs. Another initiative of HEFCE has been the Online Learning Task Force, and you can read about that in this article within the Times Higher Education site. Online tuition options are not second rate, says the task force chair. You might debate that. Here is the online version of the quite comprehensive Brown review into higher education, and you can watch the video of the introduction and read the full report on this site. The Brown report is influential because it proposes that higher education as we know it cannot continue in the way that we know it. It has to change in some ways. Will it change by more online learning? Here are some predictions of the future path of development for higher education. As already stated, traditional higher education programs concentrated on classical Renaissance education in the Greek tradition, relying heavily on Greek literature and Greek philosophical positions. And although many students have probably expressed interest in teaching in primary settings, this report by HEFCE indicates initiatives undertaken within universities such as Liverpool at promoting philosophical thinking within the primary sector at a much earlier age, and also the Aim Higher initiatives of getting non-traditional students more interested in university within school settings. And you can see the logic in this, in that many of us will have relied on our parents influencing our decisions to come to university, and many disadvantaged groups do not have those types of conversation in the family home. Another initiative that is gaining momentum is the Philosophy for Children initiative, about introducing philosophical and critical reasoning skills much earlier on. Many of us that experience the national curriculum and its quite prescriptive approach to learning can often feel quite shocked when we move into higher education and there's an expectation that students are supposed to pursue their learning with much less direction, and also making a jump from being told the answers to moving into this, as I've said, classical Greek tradition of questioning and finding out the ideas for oneself. Hence, by introducing these ideas and courses such as Philosophy for Children much earlier on, it's anticipated that the jump into higher education and the shock is not quite as severe. Will higher education be typified by different types of learning? And the idea that we've touched on with the online task force is this idea of blended learning. And there's a definition from Hines and Proctor of what blended learning is. A variety of different teaching methods being used. And you can click Hines and Proctor's article and read it for yourself by clicking that link. Here is an example of an established blended learning approach from the States. I do recommend that you click on the MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology University website and see the kind of things that they're doing regarding blended learning. OpenCourseWare, for example. Here we can click on, let's take political science. I'm afraid that we've run out of time for this video, but you can click through the summary yourself. It's quite straightforward and self-explanatory. Thank you.